For those of you who may not be aware, Schoolhouse Connection is a national nonprofit that works to overcome youth homelessness through education. We provide strategic advocacy, practical assistance, policy reform work, and other resources to schools, early childhood programs, institutions of higher education, service providers, families, and youth, including those with lived experience in homelessness. I am Director of State Policy, so I get to lead our policy reform efforts in various states across the US. And my team also oversees our Policy Fellows program, which is the reason that we are here today. You're going to hear from one of our Policy Fellows, and I'll talk briefly about what the program offers, what it aims to do, and ways in which you might be able to get involved. I also invite you to visit our website, schoolhouseconnection.org, through which you can get a wealth of resources related to federal and state policy advocacy, information that's shared between service providers who work with youth experiencing homelessness through our Q&A feature. We also have a trove of webinars that are archived that provide training resources and issue information I think you might find of interest. And you can also get more information on our Youth Leadership and Scholarship Program, which is a great initiative that actually provides money for youth experiencing homelessness as they enter college. And we also have a team that works with them to help them get into and navigate through higher education. As I mentioned, my team oversees our Policy Fellows Initiative, which is a program that we started a couple years ago that allows us to connect with a network of advocates across the US who we train and support so that they can be more active in engaging folks in their states in our federal and state level advocacy. We are on our second cohort now. The second cohort of Policy Fellows represents 7 states in the congressional districts in those states. We have 14 fellows who've been working this year to engage their US reps and their US senators around 3 priorities aimed at increasing funding and resources dedicated to helping address youth homelessness in their respective states. I'm going to allow one of those fellows to introduce herself now.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Takoa Boatner. I'm the Executive Director of Youth Oasis, which is a youth services agency. My credentials are Board Certified Human Services Practitioner. And as a youth services agency in the Baton Rouge, Louisiana, we directly work with students experiencing homelessness, youth experiencing homelessness, and we provide services through emergency shelter, and community-based support groups and basic needs as those needs arise.
Thank you. And as for housekeeping, I want to encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat by including your name, your title, and your organization. You should also know that today's webinar is being recorded in case you didn't see that up top. And everyone who registered will get a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. Today, we're going to go over some information about student homelessness to give you a better idea of what it looks like, what it is, and what it isn't, ways in which we are advocating for it, both in Louisiana and in other states around the country, what we're doing at the federal level specifically, and then things that you can do to assist. So nationally, there are about 1.2 million youth experiencing homelessness pre-K through grade 12. Many schools report challenges in identifying students who are experiencing homelessness. So while this is a really sizable figure, we know that it's an undercount because in many cases, students and their families don't want to be identified as homeless. Homelessness has many faces. While people think about homeless individuals as those they see on the streets or those they identify with panhandling and so forth. The reality is that the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness are those you can't see. We call them the hidden homeless. Those are people who are staying in motels or staying with friends or family as a result of some housing challenges they may encounter, or staying in shelters, be they homeless shelters or domestic violence survivor shelters or similar types of facilities, or in some cases living doubled up or tripled up even.
So, as the Louisiana Policy Fellow, of course, representing our local area, my role is to bring light to what our numbers actually are. And many of you have heard me get on a soapbox before about the number of youth that we serve and the differences in the numbers as they're reported. Total, using the Department of Education's definition of homelessness, there are 11,768 youth experiencing homelessness in the state of Louisiana. 6% of those youth are unsheltered. So this is what we normally considered as homeless when most people think of it. So they have nowhere to be. Shelters represent places like St. Vincent de Paul, Youth Oasis, other agencies that may provide emergency residential services, emergency shelter short term. Then that's about 4% live there. Hotels and motels, it's about 6% are found there. And nighttime residents doubled up 83.7%. So you will see, based on the way the numbers are falling, where the youth are that are experiencing homelessness and the scope of what it really looks like. So the bulk of our youth that are experiencing homelessness are experiencing it in doubled up situations, meaning their housing is unstable, right? There are 614 students experiencing homelessness that are unaccompanied. So we're talking about our older youth at this point, and that's based on FAFSA determination. So these are youth who are attending college, and that is a really silent population of youth because, again, once youth get to college, there's an assumption that they're well-resourced, and that's not always the case.
Thank you. And I'll just add that figure for unaccompanied youth, as Takoa mentioned, is a small percentage, but this is really the 11th and 12th graders, so it doesn't include some of those younger unaccompanied youth who are also part of that population. So we know that this figure is much larger than what you see here. Homelessness impacts education, and that is significant because education is the single greatest way that youth are able to avoid homelessness as adults. 42% of students who have experienced homelessness say they have dropped out of school at least once, and 60% say it's hard to stay in school while dealing with all of the difficulties that homelessness brings about. Homelessness is associated with an 87% likelihood of dropping out of school, chronic absenteeism, and disproportionate discipline that students often face. And over time, the achievement gaps between homeless and low-income students, particularly at the earlier grades, tend to persist or even worsen. As you see here, the lack of a high school diploma or GED is the single greatest risk factor for young adult homelessness. It makes it 346% more likely. That's significant as youth progress towards adulthood because more than 2/3 of jobs require some form of post-secondary education. And that is why the McKinney-Vento Act is so important when it comes to helping youth address the many challenges associated with homelessness. The McKinney-Vento Act addresses barriers in a number of ways, including keeping students in their school of origin, which is important when you think about the ways in which homelessness forces families to relocate, oftentimes multiple times during a school year. And that brings about challenges with not only enrollment, but with transportation, with re-enrolling in another school when they are forced to move from one area of their community to another. And then in addressing the many barriers to graduation from credit accumulation, for example. I mentioned discipline earlier, is one of those issues that comes up frequently, as does attendance, right? As students are forced to deal with all those challenges related to being unstably housed. McKinney-Vento services are designed for those children and youth who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. As we mentioned before, that looks different, but includes homelessness. And people, as we said before, tend to only think about the homeless folks that they see. They don't think about those who are sharing housing as a result of economic hardship or tragedy, like a fire, for example. Those who are living in motels or hotels or trailer parks or camping grounds as a result of having inadequate accommodations. Those who are living in all kinds of shelters. I mentioned domestic violence survivor shelters before, but emergency or transitional shelters as well, or living in places that are not fit for suitable living. Those places that are substandard, for example, or places where people are forced to take shelter that are not homes, including their cars or in parks or abandoned buildings or abandoned homes. I'm going to pause for a moment to address any questions that you all may have. And again, feel free to drop questions into the Q&A box. We'll also try to monitor the chat box as well. But ideally, if you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature to submit them. We'll pause again to handle questions after we go over the federal legislative ask. And seeing none, we will move forward. So our policy fellows have been studying some of the challenges present with regard to federal legislation that could help youth experiencing homelessness across the country. The priorities we identified relate to funding, including both additional funding and the flexibility that educators need to use those funds in ways that allow them to address the specific needs in their communities that are impacting the youth they serve and their families. We are also looking at ways in which we can remove the barriers to higher education that youth experiencing homelessness face as they leave the K-12 system and move on into colleges and universities, but don't have the same sort of support that McKinney-Vento provides them in elementary, middle, and high school, for example. And then we're also looking at ways in which we can address a lot of the overall needs of children, youth, and families. I'm going to turn it over to Koya to talk about a couple of these priorities.
So as Rod mentioned, the priorities that we've been working on this year, the first one is to provide flexible funding for students experiencing homelessness. So the impact of the ARP funding had increased it. So before this funding occurred, there were only about 2% of the schools, and I can't recall specifically whether it was in Louisiana or across the nation, but only 2% of schools had this flexible funding and had ability to provide services. This increased that number to about 20%. And we do have to thank our speaker, Mike Johnson, for the continuing resolution. So this funding has been extended till January 19th for a handful of agencies. flexible funding is not just a strategy that works in this area. It actually works across most youth services because of the transitory nature of youth, especially youth experiencing homelessness. When you have the ability to flex your funding and make your funding responsive to the needs as they arise, you get better service coverage, you get better outcomes that way. The next one is what they call HESH-FEE. And so this is removing barriers for homeless and foster youth in higher education. And this is something that I spoke to a little bit earlier about not recognizing that our youth in college, even though they're in college, they're still not well resourced, and there's many of them still experience homelessness while they're in school. And what this policy is reintroduction of the bipartisan Higher Education Access and Success for Homeless and Foster Youth Act. This will require the designation of a dedicated higher education liaisons for homeless and foster youth in college. So this is not something that is currently happening in universities. And as a anecdotal story, many of the youth that we serve, these are older youth, and we've seen some of our youth, when they finally cross that barrier to get into college, not have the continued supports that they need, that they received in a program like ours or a similar program. And unfortunately, they still need that, because again, we're still talking about a developing brain, and then we're developing brain in a new environment. And so a lot of those same activation points are going to be present, and there's not a supportive system in that environment for those youth. And so this is what this act can do if it's passed. And I'll turn that back over to Rod.
Thank you. I'll add that HESH-FEE is a bipartisan effort. And while there is not a current bill, there was one introduced in the prior session. It's HR 6666, and I can share with you more information on how you can look that up. But we do expect reintroduction of that bipartisan legislation at some point over the next few months. There is a bill aimed at addressing some of those challenges that youth and their families are facing, which is known as the Homeless Children and Youth Act. It's HR 5221, as you see here. And this bill is important in that it would align federal definitions of homelessness by amending HUD's definition so that children and youth identified by McKinney-Vento now would be eligible for HUD homeless assistance. So it would basically streamline definitions so that everyone's working on the same accord and identifying those children and youth who are most vulnerable and in need of services. There are about 15 co-sponsors on this bill. We don't have representation from Louisiana yet, so I'm hoping that's something that you all might be interested in assisting us with. And we'll talk about ways in which you might be able to do that in just a moment.
Rod, before you move on, I do want to jump in on that, because that's a bill that's particularly close to my heart, because the 11,000 youth that we identified earlier, not all of those youth will have access to some of the housing services that we have because they are funded through HUD, and HUD doesn't recognize that definition. And that's why this type of work is important, and that's why it's important to understand where the dollars are coming from and how they're actually allocated in the state to make sure that we're making the most efficient use of our dollars that's being allocated to youth.
Thank you. I appreciate you for elaborating on that and providing additional clarity. We are hosting this webinar now because the December-January period is a great time to both educate our elected officials and to advocate for the young people that we seek to serve. I mentioned these legislative priorities being bipartisan, and that has been the case throughout the time we've been working on them. And given the slim margins in both the House and the Senate, we really need folks to reach out to their representatives regardless of what side of the aisle they are on. So as you can see here, our House is pretty evenly split, with a slim majority for Republicans, and the Senate the same way, with a slim majority for Democrats. The independents that you see indicated here tend to meet with the Democrats, which provides the Democrats a small majority. So what can you do? You can help by asking your US rep or your US senator to support robust, flexible funding for students experiencing homelessness in fiscal year 2024, the upcoming budget, and also to support the reforms in higher education to provide students more support, similar to the support that they get in the K-12 system now, through the introduction and support for HESV, and to sign on as a co-sponsor of the Homeless Children and Youth Act, HR 5221. And I saw one question in the chat related to COVID, and I can tell you that COVID did impact the numbers, as they impacted the numbers relative to education like they impacted everything else, right? One of the things that it did result in is making it more difficult to adequately identify and to serve a lot of those youth. So we saw numbers drop in many cases, as a result of schools losing contact with those young people. And in addition to that, we saw an awful lot of need, and needs that went unaddressed as a result of not being able to connect with those young people and their families. And Takoa, I don't know if you want to speak on that at all, but I'll
Yes,
encourage you to.
sure. Personally, we did see COVID had a huge impact, and call it divine timing or serendipity, but our emergency shelter opened 2020. And that's when we saw an increase of our annual service numbers from 120 to 250 across all of our programming. And our basic needs programming really increased. We were seeing about 80 youth a month between 2020 and 2022. And that was unusual for us, definitely, and I believe that had a direct impact of because of COVID.
And I saw a question about the presentation. Everyone who registered will get a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the presentation. And I'm just checking the chat to make sure I didn't overlook any questions. Oh, thank you for dropping that in there. All right. Just trying to multitask and make sure nothing slips through the cracks. Thank you for the assist. Before we move on, I did also want to give you an opportunity to talk about your experience as a policy fellow. What your biggest takeaway so far from participation in the program has been, will be the first question. And two, what feedback you might have to share about your work to reach out to your elected officials.
The biggest takeaway that I had from the experience of being a policy fellow is the opportunity to understand the policies that are funding some of the work that we do. Not all of the policies have a direct funding line to the services that we provide, but as a service provider seeking to provide holistic services, it's important to understand where all the lines intersect, so that not only are we able to find some parallel lines so that we can keep a continuity of services going, but we can possibly avoid some potential minefields of getting involved, getting entangled in the red tape of the legislation. So that was very a useful experience for me. In speaking with the representatives, what I find is that all of our representatives that I spoke with, and that was Representative Carter, Senator Kennedy, and Cassidy, They're all supportive of youth and youth services. And I do believe our challenge is to be more thorough about connecting the dots of what this legislation means and not just identifying the base outcome. And the base outcome is housing youth, yes, but we're also talking about human services. And the scope of that simply means that a homeless youth is not just a youth experiencing homelessness, right? You have now a youth that's experiencing a form of trauma that's going to have ripples in how they interact with the education system, how they interact with the healthcare system, how they interact with law enforcement. All of these outcomes can be directly tied back to housing, which is a major social determinant of health. And so it's important that we as constituents make our elected officials aware that we're not just asking you to house youth, we're asking to improve our economic future. Because if we have 1.2 million youth who are experiencing homelessness right now, unless we put in services and unless we put in structures and supports to resolve this, our economy is going to be impacted by this, because that experiences has direct paths to lower lowered wages over time, lowered capacity for sustainable employment, lowered capacity for higher employment. So that's what I'd like to share with everyone on what our responsibilities are. And what I've learned being a policy fellow is how our messaging needs to be more thorough and it needs to be holistic in what we're saying.
You sound like someone who's becoming an effective advocate. So I
Been
asked
doing
you
this for a
about,
minute.
yeah, I asked you about your biggest takeaway. Did anything surprise you during your interactions with legislators and their staffers?
I can't say that I was surprised by anything in particular. I was very heartened to see that they all responded and they all were very willing to speak with me, and I was very heartened to see that, and was not surprised to hear that they do support youth, because I've interacted with those offices on other occasions and I know that they support youth. And so I appreciated the opportunity to ask them to put some money behind that support, and so that was fun.
Amen. All right. So for those of you who may be interested in helping engage your elected officials, we have opportunities for you to do so, and we are available to help both better educate you on some of the issues that we talked about in the webinar today, as well as others related to youth homelessness, and to provide you the materials and other resources necessary to become effective advocates. To learn more about the legislation that we talked about with you today, I encourage you to go to congress.gov. You can type in 6666 to see the heat fee legislation that was introduced last session. Just look for legislation from 2022 and just type in 5221 to learn more about the Homeless Children and Youth Act. You can also see who signed on to those bills, both the prior session and this session, and get more information about your elected officials as well. It's always a good idea, if you are interested in seeing what your elected officials are up to follow them on social media. X, formerly known as Twitter, is something that most of them are active on. I also encourage people I work with to follow their elected officials on LinkedIn, because many of them have begun using that more frequently as X has gone through its transition. You can also follow the work that we do, both at the federal and state levels, through our e-newsletter and on our federal and state policy pages at schoolhouseconnection.org. And you, if you want to reach out to me directly, can do so at my email address here, which is rod@schoolhouseconnection.org. For those of you who may be interested in signing up to become advocates, I encourage you to scan the QR code here, which would allow you to join our advocacy network. And that is the resource we use for sort of onboarding volunteers who want to actually go through the training on setting up virtual meetings or in-person meetings, preparing for them, executing them, providing the appropriate issue information for elected officials. We also provide you talking points so that you can effectively carry out those meetings and the conversations that take place during them. And I put the web page address here in the event you have any issues scanning the QR code, but you can always just go to schoolhouseconnection.org. And with that, Takoya, did you have anything else you wanted to share with folks before we sign off?
As always, if you have any youth in need, please give us a call or go to our website. The website is the best way, easiest way to get in contact with us. If you have questions or if you want to talk with me about how you can help our work with youth services, please give me a call or email. And I appreciate all of you for taking time today to come and hear me advocate about youth, because I do it all the time, and I'm sure most of you are tired of hearing it, but I appreciate your care and concern. And I know that the more people hear the message and share the message, the more effective we can be.
And you do a great job at it.
Thank you.
And I thank you for helping Schoolhouse Connection in the work that we do. Thank you all once again for joining us today. As I mentioned, both the recording and the PowerPoint will go to all who registered. And with that, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Take care.